Let's talk to Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you? It's still
Well,
below freezing here.
it's a bit cold in London, but the sky's blue, which always cheers me up. It's a very cold day in Downing Street at the moment. Boris is hunkering down, frightened to go out in case anybody asks him a question he doesn't want to answer. He's apparently discovered that he was indeed at a function that he thought he couldn't remember whether he was at, and he now knows so much about it that he can tell us he was there for 25 minutes. But let's have a listen before we go on to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was on with Jeremy Kyle yesterday, attempting to kind of ameliorate the situation.
Today, a DUP MP, Jim Shannon, he cried talking about his mother-in-law dying alone of COVID. Can you and your colleagues look Jim Shannon full square in the face and say, we were at a drink, not you, the Prime Minister's at a drinks party and you couldn't see your mother-in-law, we're really sorry. Does he believe you, Jim Shannon?
Jim Shannon is a wonderful man, a most brilliant parliamentarian. Jim and I, somebody of the House, work relatively closely together, and he is a great contributor to Parliament. He is there more than any other MP. And what he said was desperately moving. And that's why it was right that the Prime Minister apologised today and said that with hindsight he would have done things differently. But I would say that everybody makes mistakes. It is only human, that nobody gets every decision right. But you have to look at the overall picture of the Prime Minister's leadership, which is formidably in the interests of the nation.
Formidably in the interest of the nation. Well, you might say that, but Helen, you've seen plenty of politicians come and plenty of politicians go, I'm sure, in your career. This one has got all the markings of the black spot, hasn't it?
Boris Johnson's behaviour with the party that he did go to, and then the behaviour of a lot of other people, including civil servants and health advisors. Remember Catherine Calderwood, remember Professor Pants Down the Bonking Boffin, Neil Ferguson, remember Dominic Cummings. This is symptomatic of a wider culture of impunity amongst the great and the good. And it has now made its way, unsurprisingly in my view, all the way up to the Prime Minister. The risk here is that if you bin Boris, and I agree with the Labour chap who says it's likely to be the local council elections in May and the increase in everybody's energy price, gas bills and things like that are likely to really push it to sort of the final stage of the whole exercise, is that the culture of impunity is so pervasive that the mooted replacements for Boris, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, are the two front runners, as I think everybody acknowledges,
yes,
who are currently both very popular, and liked. The danger is that everybody among the great and the good, or very large numbers of people among the great and the good, of supposedly running and advising and drafting these rules, has been swept up in this. Where were they? It's only a matter of time if one of them went to a party, yes, or one of them broke the rules.
Well, Angela Rayner has apparently submitted a question today. I'm not quite sure whether it's to Boris Johnson, but certainly to the Tory party, with a request for all parties which were attended by cabinet ministers, because there's bound to be loads.
And there are rumours also about the shadow cabinet, about Keir Starmer as well. This is why I'm making this wider point about the culture of impunity.
Yeah.
I actually think this is a much, much more serious issue than just, let's see if we can get Boris Johnson's head on a plate, because there is an element of people amongst Continuity Remain who desperately loathe Boris Johnson because he was the figurehead of Vote Leave and far more effective than Michael Gove.
Oh, well, the chief sort of sabre rattler in that department is Lord Adonis, isn't it? And he put out a tweet yesterday saying, if Boris goes, Brexit goes. Well, that's plainly nonsense. Brexit is done.
No, it is plainly nonsense. But
we're not rejoining the European Union, thanks, anytime soon.
I saw people like Anna Soubry, who has pretty much given up the Continuity Remain thing, but the hatred is still there.
Yeah.
And it's a very personal hatred directed at Boris Johnson. So this is why I'm trying to capture the seriousness of the problem here, where you've got a large number of people who are really very advantaged in the game of life. And it's not just Boris Johnson and going to Eton. And I saw the the usual sort of silly lefty comments.
Yeah.
It is right across the parliament. It is right across the very medical establishment whose advice we were all supposed to be taking and whose advice was then enacted into law, then proceeded to do it. And I don't normally say very kind things about Nicola Sturgeon, but there is no doubt that Catherine Calderwood just dropped the Scottish Government right in it.
Of course.
You
Well,
know,
I mean, there's been error after error. Jonathan Van Tam, I suspect, is jumping before it all starts to go horribly wrong and the recriminations begin. Boris has said this: "I would like to thank Jonathan Van Tam for his extraordinary contribution to our country and his invaluable advice throughout the pandemic, wishing him the very best for the future." Now, this is the same guy who was part of the same team of people who killed off Christmas, who locked us down many, many times, regardless of whether Boris wanted to do it or not. This was their advice. It's not now clear whether it was a good idea. In fact, quite the reverse. It's now very clear that lockdowns have killed off large parts of the NHS, have made many, many people sicker and more ill than they ever were, and it's created a sort of mental health epidemic of people who simply don't now know how to operate in life.
And the other thing that is part of this is that, and this is what I raised in my piece for Law and Liberty about taking voluntary assumption of risk as opposed to risks being imposed on people. And thank you very much for tweeting that out so people can have a read of it at their leisure. It's quite short and mainly got lots of jokes in it, but I am trying to make a serious point in it as well about the extent to which this culture of impunity has captured the great and the good in the country, has managed to completely alienate both sides of the COVID debate, the people who are lockdown skeptics and the people who, in good faith, thought that lockdown was good science and complied with the rules and then wagged their fingers at everybody else to comply with the rules as well. And the reason for that is it looks increasingly like the extent to which the rule breaking has happened amongst these people, that the advice was not only not well formed, but was probably just in error. The risk wasn't as great as we thought it was.
No.
And this gets back to the point that I'm also making the piece and have made before on the Independent Republic, that it's now very clear that the protect your fellow citizen argument rationale for the vaccines has collapsed. It was totally about protecting the NHS and the country. You know, we have literally become a healthcare system with a country attached.
Which, by the way, they completely and utterly singularly failed to do, because the NHS has not been protected. The NHS has been ruined. It wasn't in great shape before the pandemic. It's now in even worse shape. People waiting years now to get operations, people having to go private in order to get anything done, people who can't be seen. I mean, it's an absolute shambles. People waiting 9 hours for an ambulance. I mean, it just doesn't work. And it's all because of their policies. And similarly, not only were there parties going on willy-nilly all over the place, but I know plenty of people who were in and out of Downing Street in the last 2 years. There was nobody in there doing any of the things that they were telling us to do. They were all hanging about very closely together. They were not socially distancing. They've got a couple of sort of cafes apparently in there where people were just sitting around drinking coffee. Nobody's wearing a mask. You know, I'm quite happy for them to do that, but not while everybody else is being told to do something else.
And being hit with £10,000 fixed penalty notices, which is the point that Adam Wagner and Francis Ha have made repeatedly. They're a pair of barristers who challenged all of these fines when students were being, they're not fines, they challenged the fixed penalty notices to get them reduced, so that once it becomes a fine, which is a criminal penalty as opposed to a fixed penalty notice, it has to be reduced to an amount that the person can repay, because obviously students don't have very much money, and a lot of the people who were dinged for breaching COVID rules don't have very much money. So it has to be reduced, but the price you pay for it being reduced to a fine, you know, for contesting it, is it then becomes a criminal record.
Right.
And it turns up, it's like the non-crime hate incidents. They then turn up on a DBS check. It's all of this, which is why I endorsed yesterday, and a lot of people thought that I wrote the piece or that Adam Wagner had written the piece or Francis had written the piece, but it wasn't. I think Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, wrote it, where the only honourable thing to do is to waive all of those fixed penalty notices, the big ones where people are still trying to pay them, and also to expunge the criminal records of people who have, in order to reduce the sum of money involved, have gone down the fine path and have finished up with it on a police record. And that is something, if there is a way of getting the broader public, whether through talk radio and various other outlets or through the Spectator, behind that cause, that is a worthy and honourable thing to do, to try to unpick some of the mess that has been made as a result of the great and the good in this country, including the Prime Minister being unable to follow their own rules.
Yeah, but unfortunately you can't unpick people who died. You can't unpick businesses that fell over as a result of what their policies were. You can't unpick people losing their homes, losing loved ones, not being able to see loved ones before they died, not being able to get married. You can't unpick any of that. And I'm afraid that is where they now stand. They stand in a place where they have disdain for us. They don't care about what happened. They only think about now supposedly saving Boris Johnson. Well, I don't think that is in any way the conduct of the government of this country should be involved in.
No, the rubber has really hit the road, and we've done a great big burnout. I don't know whether you have that concept over here, burnouts and donuts, where you finish up leaving more tyre rubber on the road than is actually finishes up attached to the wheels of the car.
Right.
That's what's happened, and we're in this enormous mess as a result of it. And I mean, you're getting these, and I have to say, even amongst now travel has opened up to Australia, I'm starting to hear, just to refer back to your remarks about the NHS, the classic Australian comment when people are dual nationals and have access to the Australian healthcare system, the line that is always used is, when in pain, take a plane.
Yes.
And that is always a sign that people who are familiar with a different and alternative healthcare system are starting to get really, really peed off.
Well, they are, because anyone that I know who has tried to access bits of it is having terrible frustrations managing to do so, because it simply doesn't work. And instead of spending a lot of time actually fixing what was wrong with it, they just kept telling us to protect it, and more or less giving the impression that actually it would be an awful lot better if there weren't any patients at all and all the hospitals were actually empty and we wouldn't have to do any terrible hard work. It's absolutely nonsensical what's been happening. And I think this is simply now the end for Boris Johnson, because there's been so much that has piled up. It's not one party. Nobody really cares about one party. But people do care about a sort of pattern of misleading people and of just not doing the job.
Well, the cumulative effect of the culture of impunity. That's what we're confronting now, and it's got all the way up to the Prime Minister, and it's of a piece with a lot of the other things, like the complete idiocy, all the expensive green crap, most of which, from what I understand from people who are very, very pro addressing climate change, most of which is just useless and doesn't help the environment at all.
No, of course not.
You would have to not use 1 million plastic straws to make that worthwhile. All the stuff about boilers and sending everybody's gas bills through the roof, it's all just nonsense.
And also this rubbish about cleaning up the environment, it doesn't seem to apply to the millions of lateral flow tests that get chucked away every day, and all of the masks that get thrown on the road and get found in rivers and in the sea. And it's just unbelievable. Gloves, the whole thing. Plastic everywhere, but that doesn't count as damaging, apparently, the climate or damaging the environment, because it's all there to protect
in a nightclub does.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
I know,
Well, in Scotland, you can't even get into a nightclub. So if you're unlucky enough to own one, you can't make any money. I mean, it's madness. And I know that's Boris not taking care. That's not Boris's problem in Scotland. But, this whole kind of ridiculous notion that we're going to have to do all this. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon the other day said, we'll have to wear masks for 6 years. Really? I don't think so.
I'm just thinking in terms of the culture of impunity of the SNP Westminster MP who hopped on a train and gave it to everybody else.
Right. Well, that's
COVID.
It. No, I think
just COVID positive, but COVID symptomatic and coughing and sneezing everywhere. Yay.
But this
Winning.
is the thing. But this is the thing, people have become deranged, which brings us nicely on to Novak Djokovic in Australia. And regardless of whether or not Novak Djokovic may or may not have said something which wasn't true, the bottom line is that he was given permission to come to Australia. He was given permission to play in the Australian Open. And then as soon as he landed, he was treated like a criminal.
Well, Australia does tend to do that. It's a deeply Australian trait. And there are now... I mean, there was talk after the court said, no, releasing this is ridiculous. All the documentation is here. Although Tennis Australia didn't come out looking very good, because they had basically gathered in all the documentation to themselves and were not making it available to other people, and were being really unhelpful at various points. And so the court gave them a ticking off as well for bad behaviour. But it's become, there's been noises between the Spanish and the Australian government. Apparently, Djokovic went to Marbella or something in Spain and didn't declare his vaccination status or didn't provide an exemption or whatever the story is. And so there's... But the thing is, the draw has happened for the Australian Open.
Yeah, they're not going to tell him he now has to...
They're not going to send him home now. And also, it's not just the draw has happened. He's been on the practice courts.
Yeah.
You know, there's pictures all over the Australian press of Djokovic on the practice courts. And there's also a lot of... Everybody in Australia, I mean, there are very few deaths because the country or serious illness because the country's highly vaccinated. It's even more vaccinated than here. It's something like 90%, some extraordinary number. And it down to younger ages as well. But even then, so Omicron has just gone right through the Australian population, and other tennis players have got it.
But it's also nonsensical, Helen, as some have suggested, to say that Novak Djokovic is somehow endangering anybody. I mean, he's probably the fittest man on the planet. There's nothing wrong with him. He doesn't,
He's had it twice. Honestly.
Yeah, but it's not even about that. It's about rules. Simply, it's about rules. It's not about danger. It's not about health. It's not about medical matters. It's simply about administration of rules, isn't it?
Rules for the sake of rules.
Yeah.
Rules to make people in positions of authority, I'll rephrase that. Rules to allow people in positions of authority, many of them unelected. Remember this, it's easier to make Boris Johnson accountable than it is a lot of the others. So you're getting back to the Neil Fergusons and Dominic Cummings type figures, the people who were not elected, but it's indulged this fantasy amongst a lot of people that they get to engage in the wagging finger at everybody else. Let me wag my finger at you and tell you what to do.
Yes.
So it's allowed that, and that's why you get the rules for the sake of rules, because it satisfies something deep in the heart of a lot of people.
I think that is why Julie Hartley-Brewer raised this the other day, and that is why the British public, who generally speaking are people who appreciate fair play and who encourage fair play and who actually want to see fair play from the people.
And who are very law-abiding too.
Yeah, but also, what they've seen is that these dopey rules, which caused an awful lot of anguish for an awful lot of people, were not even believed by the people making them. And that's the problem. And that's why he's got to go.
Issue. That's a huge issue. And that is probably what has unpicked public support for things like lockdown now, which has absolutely collapsed, because it has now become clear, even to the people who were very pro-lockdown, that the people who were coming up with these rules didn't believe in them. When it was just isolated cases, you could sort of go, oh yes, they were just, Ferguson and Cummings were just being twats. But now it's become so pervasive that you've finished up with the situation that even to the most zero COVID partisan, they can see that, well, no, that they made all these rules and they didn't actually believe in them.
No.
Not even the most technical expert people believed in them.
No, absolutely right. We're out of time, Helen, sadly, but thank you very much indeed.